All right, everybody, by my watch, it's 1:30, which means that it's time to get started here. Welcome. My name's Paul VanZant. I've just recently retired after 30 years as a high school teacher and department head with the Peel District School Board in Ontario. I also sit as chair of Canadian Geographic Education, and I'm one of the co-chairs of the conference committee. I hope you've enjoyed the conference so far and want to thank you for your interest in my session today on cultivating visual literacy in the geography classroom. My goal is to share with you some tried and true strategies and some classroom ready resources that you can take back and use with your students. I have to admit to being a little bit nervous. This is my first lesson of any sort since October. So I hope I'm not too far out of practice and that I can keep on time as we go. One of my challenges is that in order to present this, I can't really see the see you and see the chat. So in terms of logistics for the session, please put any questions you have in the Q&A and I'll try and address them at the end of the workshop. Any general comments that you want to share with others in the session, please put in the chat. As I said, I'll answer any questions at the end of the session. And the link for all of the materials mentioned today has been provided in the session description. And it is basically some things I've deposited on my Google Drive that may be of use to you. Let's start off with a little bit of fun here. When you take a look at this image, what do you see? I suspect if I could see the chat at first glance, somebody would say someone's making a cafe latte. In fact, you know, if we look hard enough and we know what to look for, we actually see a Piedmont Glacier in Alaska, the Malaspina Glacier. This kind of a fun image, and it actually comes off the International Geo-Olympiad multimedia test that ran this past week. Where we saw Team Canada earn 2 silver and 2 bronze medals. So I just thought I'd share that with you. It's kind of fun. The point here is that geography is everywhere if you know where to look and what to look for. And the focus of today is to look at how we can cultivate what I call visual literacy, sometimes referred to as graphical literacy in our students. Traditionally, literacy is often seen as the domain of our English departments, you know, basic reading and writing with a focus on various forms of text. But there's an increasing awareness that visuals and graphical forms can also convey meaning and are equally valid forms of communication. And as a result, we're starting to redefine how we see literacy and to recognize that literacy takes many different forms within the specific disciplines and is also very cross-curricular in nature and certainly a cross-curricular responsibility. One of the challenges that we have is in language. In geography circles over the last dozen years or so, there's been an attempt to define this notion of geographic literacy. And as my good friend, geographer and educational researcher, Dr. Lynn Moorman suggests, the idea of geographic literacy has been somewhat problematic. She argues that it's a term that is used to describe, or rather is described rather than defined. And as a result, we often see geographic literacy as simply a long checklist of knowledge and skills to be acquired. With the emphasis more often than not on the knowledge end. She argues, and I tend to agree, that instead we need to think in terms of geospatial literacy, because I think this term falls more in line with other definitions of literacy, in that it's about communicating effectively through geospatial representations, with the emphasis here on the spatial, which is, of course, our bread and butter. It is, by its very nature, geospatial literacy, kind of an amalgam of knowledge and skills and dispositions that are required to communicate, to write, and to comprehend, to read and analyze representations of geospatial information, most especially in the case of this presentation, in visual and graphical forms. I have included a link to an online article by Dr. Moorman in the folder for you to read at your leisure that helps to articulate more clearly than probably I just did the difference between geographic and geospatial literacy. But to emphasize here, the one key feature of both is that they are inherently visual in nature, as the discipline of geography has always been. And so these skills have to be explicitly taught and developed throughout our programs. I found that in teaching geography over the years, we need to establish how we are distinct from other disciplines, and often, unfortunately, to justify why geography is an important part of a student's learning journey. There are three elements that help to provide a pedagogical framework for everything that I tried to do in the classroom over the last decade of my career. First is this definition of geography, that of Gertzner, the what is where, why there, why care. We in Ontario have added the, what can we do to add action to this. And I think that this definition really helps to underscore the key elements of geography as a discipline, the concepts of space, of place, of human environment interactions, and of applying a geographic lens to when we study issues or concerns. As well, we have ties to this notion of concepts of geographic thinking. I know that initially there was a lot of work done in other parts of Canada around the concepts of historical thinking. We have our own concepts of geographic thinking, very discipline-specific thinking, spatial significance, patterns and trends, interrelationships, and the geographic perspective that are also helpful in getting students to think like geographers. And I think that's really what we're trying to do here. As well, I think that we're starting to move away from the kind of geography that I experienced as a student many, many years ago, away from the chalk and talk to more of a student-centered approach to teaching and learning. And so it's also important to develop their inquiry skills through the application of a discipline-specific inquiry model, in this case, the geographic inquiry model. The ability to have students ask questions, acquire appropriate geographic resources, interpret and analyze those resources, evaluate the materials that they have and draw conclusions, and communicate that information. And then once the process is coming to an end, to reflect and respond, and perhaps end up asking further questions to expand upon these ideas. Despite the nature of this particular diagram, this is not a linear, or in this case, a circular process. These steps need to be explicitly taught, but I would argue they don't have to be always taught in order and not necessarily all at once. Probably one of the most effective things that we can do is of course begin by asking geographic questions, but sometimes our ability to jump in and to start to interpret graphics, for example, is a good gateway into looking at forming those questions. I would argue that each one of these steps is important. It provides a focus for student-centered learning and a way to incorporate visual elements into every stage of the inquiry process, and therefore a way to help our students develop their visual literacy skills. All of these elements, the definition, the concepts of geographic thinking, and the inquiry model have been incorporated into Canadian Geographic Education's geography learning framework. I provided a link in the folder that I've provided for resources. And I would argue it's a great way to sort of reimagine and reorder your curriculum. to make it fresh, but also to incorporate these key concepts, these key ideas into everything that you do, basically. When we turn to graphical or visual literacy and start to talk about these kinds of texts, recognize that what we're trying to do is use visual forms that are more concise to illustrate how we can communicate effectively key information and to make links between various types of information. This is, as I said earlier, our bread and butter as a discipline, and they can include a plethora of different types of visuals. Obviously, diagrams, photographs, you can see the list there. Basically, just about any kind of visual communication is fair game here. And you can see, one of the more recent ones here around the power of social distancing in trying to control the spread of COVID, put out by the region of Waterloo here in Ontario. As we saw through Chris's presentation, maps themselves are important to our discipline. We all, I think, can acknowledge the importance of disciplinary specific vocabulary. In geography, maps are a form of communications all on their own. They are, I would argue, a language unto themselves because they help to convey the importance of space, of place, of interactions between people and their environment. And by their very nature, they provide a unique window through which we can understand our world. Now, I think one of the things to emphasize here is that as educators, I think we have a responsibility to introduce to our students any number of different types of maps, whether we create them through things like mental mapping or whether we're looking at topographic maps, Google Maps, road maps, metro maps, marine charts, even in the bottom right-hand corner, a map of recent fires in British Columbia. We can bring the students' experiences into the classroom through these kinds of maps, and we can provide unique perspectives by using these different types of maps. That said, I think we also need to make sure we expose our students to different types of projections so that they can recognize specific patterns and understands the strengths and weaknesses of different types of maps and different types of projections as they're presented to them. One of my favorites, obviously, is the one in the bottom right-hand corner, the world according to Australia, which I think is a lot of fun there. The one thing that every map should have is some kind of conventions checklist. And I think, unfortunately, in the past, when we're creating maps, we've tended to highlight the importance of including these mapping conventions as required mechanics. But we need to also recognize that these are teachable moments, that these conventions provide our students with important information that help them to read the maps and thus better understand the information that's being communicated. How many times in teaching have we found that the students stare at the map and they start asking questions because they haven't identified these specific elements that might help them? Everything from, an appropriate title that introduces location and purpose to, understanding the patterns that they see on the screen through the symbols and colors, to, often border illustrations or things that are put off to the side or specific graphic elements incorporated into the maps that will help them. And then, of course, by identifying these things, we can start to better judge the quality of the maps that we're dealing with as well. I think that from a basic literacy perspective, we can apply, traditional reading strategies to our maps by looking at sort of before, during, and after strategies. This map, I guess, probably better referred to as a graphic, it takes a look at Arctic sea ice, obviously, and how it is thinning. So before, we might ask, what do we know already about this topic? What are the colors trying to represent here in our legend? What does the gray represent in this case? Why are we reading this in the first place? What's our purpose? During the reading process, we want to be able to skim, identify specific patterns or trends, what particular shapes or patterns they recognize, and how well we understand what this map is actually trying to convey. And then and only then can we start to draw conclusions and predict the implications of what we see. This before, during, and after strategy is basic literacy strategy, and yet I think it's something that we often overlook sometimes, which we shouldn't, because these are strategies that students have already been exposed to, and therefore they're kind of transferable skills if we emphasize them. Obviously, there are any number of other types of visual forms. Geographic visuals are not just about maps. We can also see value in other visual forms like satellite images, aerial photographs, graphs, charts, pictograms, cartoons, and even paintings, as we'll see. And the wonderful thing about the internet is that so much of this is open source, so much of it is easy to find now. And so it gives us the opportunity to really bring into our classrooms some pretty interesting and unique perspectives through the use of visuals. I would just take a minute to also emphasize, because some of the activities that we're going to look at in a few minutes relate to graphs. That graphs, of course, themselves also have their conventions checklists. And again, I think sometimes students jump immediately to what the data is trying to show in terms of the patterns without examining the title and the axes carefully, checking the scale and the units to see what it is that's being represented before they get to trying to interpret those patterns and trends. One of the things I think that we also need to emphasize is the need to be able to make inferences, to draw conclusions, and also to make predictions from what we see. I think the predictions piece sometimes is the valuable piece that we forget. Where do we see things going in the future? And that's where our unique geographic perspective can come in that interpretation. I have decided here that, rather than continue this lengthy introduction, it might be better to jump in and take a look at some specific activities that utilize these strategies. I've always felt that the most valuable professional development sessions that I've attended in the past provide participants with what I call the hands-on Monday morning activities. So in the activities that follow, I'm going to try and illustrate a few examples of specific strategies to develop visual literacy in our students, along with everything you need to use those activities or modify them as you see fit in your own classroom. So you will have what you need at your fingertips. All of the activities have been shared through the link in the session description and Hopin. I'm not going to go into detail on every single activity because, quite frankly, I think I've overbuilt this presentation a little bit. But instead, I'm going to try and highlight a couple that best illustrate some specific visual literacy strategies. There are about a dozen activities in total, and I'm hoping that you'll find at least one of them to be useful in your own setting. I'm going to emphasize two pieces around mapping. And again, you can decide, how valuable you think they are. One of my absolute favorite things to do with students is to begin them on the first day with a mental mapping exercise, to have the students actually create a mental map of Canada. And we begin with kind of a visualization, eyes closed, lights off, picture the coastline of Canada, where can you see the major bodies of water, the rivers, the political boundaries, etc. And then once they visualize it, to try and draw it. The cool thing is that it gives us a little bit of a window into sort of prior knowledge, or in many cases lack thereof. But it also allows us to see how we all visualize our country differently, and how to introduce mapping conventions in many ways. I actually do this on the first and the last day of the class, so that the students can see how they've progressed. And thankfully, most of them have done so over the course of a semester. The other thing is that I have a PowerPoint which I've shared with you, where they can also compare their mental maps to those of students from other parts of Canada, to sort of understand how our experiences tend to shape the way we see our country and how much detail we can provide. So that's kind of a fun one for me. The second one is what I call, Oh Canada, getting to know our country. And in grade 9, every student in Ontario is required to take a compulsory geography. And I can remember back to my own experiences in geography class, where we were given a blank map and a long list of items and asked to locate them on the map, followed by 1 or 2 quizzes to see whether we could get it or not. This was a mechanical exercise, and then one in rote learning, basically memorization, and in my estimation, pretty limited in terms of its value to learning. This activity is a bit of a different approach, because it asks students to think critically. The task actually is one, I'll summarize it fairly briefly here. They're going to be presented with a number of different maps. In my case, I was lucky to have atlases where they could look at different types of maps, determine the kind of information that was being communicated. They recorded these things in an organizer, and then they had to determine, okay, what's the most important information? What do we absolutely have to know? And so it was a process then of developing criteria to evaluate what's most important. Once they'd established those criteria, they had to bring everything down to between 50 and 70 pieces of information, recognizing that one city on a map represented one piece of information. And so it was, it was difficult to sift through, but it got them thinking about how things were visualized on a map, what was important information, what was not, and then how are we going to incorporate it into our own maps. And they were given, basically an outline map of Canada in order to develop that. And of course, with the expectation that they would use proper mapping conventions as they went. Right or wrong wasn't necessarily the point here. It was, again, the thinking that was important. And of course, we could judge whether the thinking was taking place by having them justify why they included the information they did. This was something I tended to assess rather than evaluate. And that kind of feedback was a good place to start in thinking about, how we can improve over the course of the semester. I think since we're talking about maps, I better plug really quickly here a couple of CanGeo Education resources here. Obviously, our giant floor maps are a huge hit across the country and can be used in a number of different ways with some great supporting lessons. I also like the tiled maps. I've printed some of these off. They're a great kind of icebreaker, not only with students, but with teachers in a workshop in terms of, putting the map together and then examining which of the concepts of geographic thinking did we utilize even, subconsciously in putting those maps together. In particular, of course, the notion of patterns and trends here. But a great way to get our students engaged with maps. I also really liked using photographs. I've shared 5 different activities with you. Probably the one that I like the best is one I call Where Are We in Canada? I tend to do this a little bit low tech. I provide groups of students with a number of images that I've collected over the years from calendars and, sometimes my Canadian Geographic magazine, for example. And we give them to the students and we say, okay, identify where you think these places are in Canada and actually have them put them up on the roll down wall map in the classroom. And what's fascinating is to see how close the students actually get. I mean, there are any number of factors, whether it's, prior interest, prior exposure, maybe personal experiences that they've had in traveling around the country, being able to look at specific elements and decipher them. They're looking at that image in the top left-hand corner. Okay, it's black, it looks sandy. Oh, this must be the oil sands. I don't know much about it, but I know they're in Alberta someplace. Again, I use this as an introduction to the concepts of geographic thinking. What strategies did you use? And how do they link to the notions of spatial significance, patterns and trends, interrelationships, and the geographic perspective? And it's amazing to me how well the students do. Being right obviously isn't important, but instead what they glean from the image and from the thinking process. And I think it sets them off well for the remainder of the course. I won't take credit for this particular piece, but I show it only because I taught in this school for the last 24 years, where the majority of our students were enrolled in a regional arts program. And this is a particular activity where our visual arts students, who are a little bit quieter and maybe don't demand as much attention, they really liked it because this was kind of their jam. And this is part of a lesson that was incorporated by Clark and Wallace in the first edition of their Making Connections book. And the images I actually got from the Creative Commons here. But these are 4 images of glaciated landscapes or landscapes that were impacted by glaciation in Canada. And after a lesson on glaciation, we do a debrief here in terms of, are we seeing the work of ice sheets or alpine glaciation, erosion or deposition? What potential human activities might take place on this landscape? And then a really good discussion around the strengths and weaknesses of paintings as a source of geographic information. And again, that allows us to explore our visual literacy skills, to recognize that, by its very nature, art tends to accentuate some things and in some cases eliminate others. And, is that a positive or is that a negative thing from a geographic perspective? This particular activity is one that I used with my world issues students. And I think it's important in a global issues class to get students to try and see the world from a perspective other than, for most of them, a middle-class Canadian upbringing. And so if I were to simply say to the students, tell me about this picture, I think that we get a shopping list of critiques about what the students see here. And again, their frame of reference is their own experience for the most part. So instead, I pose the question, what's right about this picture? What's positive about this photograph? Because it forces the students to actually read the image more carefully, to look for clues, to make inferences from the image. And the kids come up with some great things. Somebody pointed out at one point, if you take a look at the lace curtains in the window, maybe this is an indication of pride of ownership. We see something that is solidly built here. They're innovative in the way that they come up with building materials. One student pointed out, it looks like the young person in the window has a clean white bandage on their arm. So, perhaps they have access to healthcare. Sort of deconstructing this also helps them to kind of step back from some of their biases or some of the stereotypes that they have when looking at an image like this. And I think it's a great starting point for a world issues course. The last one's a little bit more controversial in some ways, and you'll see why in a second. This is another critical challenge. I call it you make the call. You can see the scenario here. Our groups of students are basically posing as photo editors for a newspaper, and they have to decide what will or will not run in their paper. And so again, they start by generating a set of criteria by which they would judge each individual photograph related to a global issue before they can determine whether it would be published in their paper. And the students often come up with some great responses here. Most of you as educators, particularly those of you who deal with media literacy, would probably see many of these same responses in your own classroom. I think in the context of the two images that I'm going to share, the last three are probably the most important. And in some ways, the images are quite tragic because they were taken from Haiti after the 2010 earthquake. And you can see them here. And the students have to apply their criteria and come up with an argument as to whether they would publish, none of these images, one or both. For your context, the first is an image of this individual, trying to navigate through the bodies outside of an overcrowded morgue in Port-au-Prince. The second is an attack on a looter in the streets. And you can imagine if we don't handle this properly, this can be incredibly problematic, particularly in terms of, understanding dignity and respect for others and reinforcing negative stereotypes. So there's a lot of discussion that goes on around that in terms of whether to include or not. And certainly you as a teacher have to prep that very, very carefully. The students decide, and most often than not, they will say, the top photograph, probably the bottom photograph, almost unanimously not. The big reveal here is that both of them appeared on the front page of the Toronto Star during that time. The way I also like to flip this around is to say, okay, the Toronto Star decided to publish these images, but if the big one finally struck Vancouver and these were images from Canada, would they have been included? And I think it opens us up to some really great conversations around, the way the media is willing to portray others differently than, the citizens of their own countries. So something that you can substitute your own images and use yourself. The last one, and I'm not going to get into it, is that in our grade 9 course, as a summary to our resources unit, we also had the students develop a photo essay, whereby instead of long written reports, instead students are going to use images, and those images have to have a one-line caption and then a critical thinking question, an inquiry question attached to each of them. And if you've developed their visual literacy skills properly to evaluate the images, to assess which ones should be included and which should not, and how effective they are, this can be a lot of fun for students, and a way of getting away from sort of traditional writing, which can be quite boring. And certainly your librarian can help you by way of finding open source materials, open source images that students can use for an activity like this. To keep things moving here, one of the other key pieces that I wanted to emphasize today was graphing and analysis. It says population graphing and analysis. I've thrown a bonus in here around climate comparisons as well. I made a conscious decision in my teaching a number of years ago to move away from a lot of hand-drawn graphs. Students do them all the time. They do them in other places. And I think that many of us find they do them abysmally, when they're doing by hand, because they rush them. Often they'll also spend more time on the mechanics and less on the analysis, and we want to emphasize the analysis. So I moved first to using Excel, and then as our board transitioned to Google, to using Google Sheets. For all the activities that you're going to see that follow, you have the instructions along with the data to graph using Google Sheets, and in many cases I've also included the analysis questions that go along with them, so that your students can create their graphs and then do the follow-up pieces. I tend to try and simplify this a little bit for the students, and so I employ what we call sort of the T methodology here, where students take a look at the trends and the patterns of the graph, the particular evidence that they can find, including things like the title, the axes, the scale, as well as the data, but then also to identify some of the anomalies that they see. I use the old Sesame Street. One of these things is not like the others, and can you identify what's not like the other pieces here? So let's take a look at this first graph, which is one that the students can develop on Canada's demographic transition. We're basically graphing birth rates and death rates starting in 1856 and right through to 2016. And the majority of this data came directly from census data here. So what do we see? Okay, well, we'll say to the students, what do we see on our x-axis? Well, we see years. Okay, what are our intervals? We're looking at 5-year intervals. Why 5-year intervals? Well, it's 5 years between census. 10 years for a major census, 5 years for a minor census. Our y-axis, what's that showing us? All right, these are rates per thousand. Well, what does that mean? Well, we don't want to graph, the overall numbers, because our total population changes. So we're going to reduce it to a rate per thousand people in the population, and therefore we're going to have a more valid comparison. All right, our legend tells us blue is births and orange here is deaths. We've got a pretty good handle, and we can see from our title that it's about transition. It's about how things change. One of the first things that we would encourage the students to do here is to take a look at lines of best fit. All right, if we're looking at trends, what do we see? Well, despite some fluctuations, birth rates have gone down. And despite some fluctuations, death rates have gone down. But we can see a couple of things that sort of stick out here that we maybe need to explain. We can see an anomaly here and another one here. And that leads us into some really good discussion, some good questioning around, okay, what does that period here that appears to be from, sort of post World War II till about 1965. What is that? Oh, that's the baby boomer generation. What impact have they had? Well, we can see it in terms of, some rising death rates. That was our biggest portion of the population. Now they're getting older. They're starting to pass on. We can see an uptick in those deaths. We can see our birth rates are starting to level off because old people don't make babies. So it gives us an opportunity to dig a little bit deeper here. One of the other things that I also like to do with this is that rather than have students answer questions on a separate sheet, this is one of those pieces where having the students actually annotate their graphs is more valuable, because now they've got that one page where they can see everything. They can see those elements that we've asked them to analyze, and we can see their observations. We can see their conclusions. And what I didn't add here is that we would ask them then to predict, what do we see 10 years, 20 years, 50 years down the line in terms of these trends based on what appears on our graph. And so it allows us a jumping off point to look at the implications, particularly for young people who are going to deal with the consequences of this demographic shift in Canada. The other piece in looking at graphs that we emphasized in our program was around the use of population pyramids. And you can see one here from 1851. And again, we'd have them deconstructed in terms of their axes, which is male, which is female on this graph, what's our time frame here. But I think we can go a little bit further. And this is where we actually get them to read the graph itself. What is the visual telling us? What does that bottom bar in our graph tell us? Well, it tells us that we've got a pretty large birth rate. And that gap in the first two bars would be an indication that our infant mortality rate is actually quite high at this time. The fact that our pyramid narrows so quickly, we know that there's a fairly significant death rate. And we can see that also in the fact that the upper bars of our graph are fairly small. And of course, we can make some judgments here as well around the dependency load. And so we'll get the students to break this down and then provide them with 4 different periods in Canadian history, from 1851 through to here it's 2011. I've actually provided you now with the 2016 census data so that they can do a comparison over time. And we'll get them to also dig into the data tables a little bit to do some calculations as well. I think those data tables are also a valid graphical form that they have to be able to read and to extract information from. But it allows us then to look at, not only how has Canada's, population changed over time, but to then explore the why. Why are we seeing such large birth rates in 1851 and such high infant mortality rates then, compared to later times? What has changed in our society? And so I think this is a great way of examining a graphical form here and being able to encourage the students to read those as we would any other text. Since we're playing with graphs, circle graphs as well, here we've got some data from 1961 and 2016. Here I actually have them do a comparison and then develop their own inquiry questions. What do we want to know when we examine these two graphs and we see the differences? What do we want to know about them? And so the students will often take a look at, the reasons behind this demographic shift in terms of our sources of immigration. What has changed to create that? Why do we see such a small percentage that saw their heritage in Asia and the Pacific in 1961 versus 2016? And then, the nice thing is It takes a look at push and pull factors, but it also takes a look at national policies and how they impact immigration as well. As I said, I'm not going to talk about the climate graphs piece here. I have included the data in the worksheets to do a comparative analysis. Again, this is not only just about creating the graphs in Google Sheets, but also how we read the tables, how we do the calculations to introduce another element. Those pieces are there. I'm sure many of you have done something similar. They're there for you to take a look at. And I've taken a look at 5 different places across Canada to show how the factors that affect climate are different in different cities. So obviously, we'll want to make sure we introduce those factors that affect climate before we get to this activity as well. The one last piece that I wanted to share, and I know I'm going a little bit quickly here, is an activity that really focuses on conversations. And we utilize our visual literacy strategies here, but we also help to build, constructive conversation strategies in the classroom as well. This is one I used with an environment and resource management course, grade 12 course that I taught a few years ago. And it's based on the work of an educator by the name of Joe Nelson. The book is a little bit older. It's 2007, but it's called The Art of Focused Conversation for Schools. I'm sure that your professional libraries in your boards would have them. It talks about the functions of the method, but what I really like about it is the utilization of 4 different levels of questioning. Objective level, reflective level, interpretive level, and decisional level types of questions. This particular activity, as I said, was designed as an introduction to the method, but also the introduction to a course on environmental issues that are going to be studied during the year. The strategies, this is a group activity, obviously, in order to get people conversing, works best with no more than 4 students. The students themselves can choose one student to facilitate the discussion. They're going to get the question template, which I'll show you in a second. And we're going to explain what it is that we want to try and accomplish. And then the students are given basically a mosaic of photographs that relate to environmental issues. They're going to take a look at those images, and they're going to work their way through the questions as part of the conversation process. And then as a group, you come together and talk a little bit about the methodology and how we're going to apply it. Here's a sample of the kinds of environmental mosaic that I might provide. I think I've given you one in the file. I've also done it with political cartoons, both for world issues and for environmental issues. It's equally effective in using those forms as well. But what I really like here are the kinds of questioning. We start with our working assumptions, and then we go around the table. What image jumped out for you when you're looking at it? Which one was most intriguing? Which one was most unsettling? Does it trigger particular memories for you, or tie back to particular situations and experiences from the past that you might be reminded of? You can see them there, and I think there's a lot of fun here in the conversation piece. And I would certainly say that of all the classes that I taught, this particular group really embraced the methodology, and I found that we moved away from kind of, what do you think about this? Well, I think this. Well, why? I don't know. I just think it. To actually being far more reflective in their thought process and in their conversation process. So I've shared that with you as well, and I hope that it might be something that would be useful to you. I've rushed. I know that I've rushed a little bit, and I hope I haven't overwhelmed you. Certainly, as part of this whirlwind tour here, I hope you got something out of the session that you find useful. I'm happy to answer some questions. I've got about 10 minutes left to do so. But of course, if you have any other questions later on, you can email me at the email that you see on the screen there, vangeo@gmail.com. I'm going to stop sharing this and go into the questions here, and I'll try and address as many of them as I can in the time that's remaining. Go back. Here, maybe I put you all to sleep. Maybe nobody's left. We'll see. Let's take a look at the Q&A. Oh, I haven't got any questions, so let me see if anybody threw any in the chat there. Where can we find the resources you mentioned? The session description, on the screen, you can see the link to the presentation folder. It's a Google Drive. If you're having problems, email me and I'll send you another link. Joanna, I absolutely agree that Jamboards are a great way of doing this more, more high tech. Particularly, I would say that where in Canada activity would be a good one, or the deconstructing the graphs as you suggested there would certainly be valuable. I have to admit that as we transition to online, Jamboard wasn't my strength. My wife became quite adept at it, but I certainly did. I see at least one question in the chat here. Could I share my email again? I'm going to type it in the chat. I have to say that, two things here. One, obviously I've had the benefit over the years of some great mentors in education. They've done a wonderful job of helping me to develop those strategies. One of my colleagues is in the session. I can see Jane Kerr-Wilson's commented. I worked with Jane on a number of things over the years, and certainly have benefited from her wisdom and the wisdom of a lot of other people that are here. I always say that you can't reinvent the wheel every time. You're only as good as what you can, beg, borrow from other people and adapt to make it your own. And certainly, I'm looking at a situation now as I've retired that. I've got a lot of things that I'm happy to share, and hopefully here you've got at least one or two things that would be classroom ready for you. I'm just going to go back through the chat really quickly to make sure I didn't miss anything. A lot of highs. All right, well, I don't see anything else there. I'll hang on for a couple more minutes, but otherwise we're transitioning into another break. And so I would encourage you to, if you need a washroom break, if you need a top off of the coffee or another snack, to do so that you're ready for the next session that starts at 1:45. And I'll hang on here for a couple more minutes if there are any more questions. Thanks everybody for your interest. I appreciate you attending today, and good luck with the rest of the conference.